thank all of you for coming today and participating in the first webinar in our series of 5 that we're organizing for the month of Francophonie. We're really excited to have a great lineup of French professors throughout New England who are giving a diverse range of topics about French and Francophone cultures. So just a few Zoom rules before I introduce Professor DeFosse on today's topic. So this is a webinar format. So right now, no one can see your video or hear you. But when Professor DeFosse has concluded her presentation, we'll open up to questions, and we're hoping for a lively discussion. There'll be 2 ways to do this. One is via the Q&A button, and the other is to raise your hand. So if you have a question that comes up during the talk, feel free to send me a question via the Q&A button, or we can wait until the end and you can press raise your hand, at which time I will promote you to a panelist so that you can be on audio and video and we can actually have a dialogue. We would prefer the raise your hand method so it can be a bit more interactive, but of course, if you're not comfortable with that, feel free to send me your questions via the Q&A chat. And I will go over this again once the presentation has concluded. So shifting back to today's lecture, some of you may know we at the consulate have taken a very strong interest in promoting the French language in Maine recently. We held a great webinar on that last December, and we've got a bunch of initiatives that have come out from that. So we're very happy in the continuity of that our first webinar is focused on the French heritage in Maine, and specifically the ways that heritage has been preserved in places like Lewiston-Auburn. So to lead us through that discussion, we're incredibly fortunate to have a prominent scholar on Franco-Americans in Maine, Mary Rice DeFosse. Professor DeFosse is Professor of French and Francophone Studies at Bates College in Lewiston, Maine. She teaches also in the programs in Gender and Sexuality Studies, Africana, and American Studies. Her research focuses on French literature, especially representations of revolution and social change, as well as questions of writing and gender. She also specializes in the history, literature, and culture of Maine's Franco-Americans. And out of that research, she actually published and co-authored a book, The Franco-Americans of Lewiston-Auburn, which came out in 2015. And she wrote, produced, and narrated the documentary, The Grey Nuns, They Came, They Served, exploring the key role that Francophone nuns played in Lewiston-Auburn's history, which was actually transformed into a permanent exhibit at the Franco-American Heritage Center in 2012, which the consul and I were fortunate enough to have visited 2 years ago. So there's a lot more to say, but in order to allow us to have time for the presentation and the questions, I'm going to hand the floor over to Professor DeFosse. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm really honored to be able to speak to people to kick off the month of Francophonie and its webinars, and to speak about the Franco-Americans in my community, the twin cities of Lewiston and Auburn on the Androscoggin River in central western Maine. My students and I have been conducting interviews since the 1990s with Franco-Americans, and more recently also with new Mainers, often refugees and asylum seekers from French-speaking Africa. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the students whose research underpins my own work and informs this webinar. And most importantly, I want to recognize the countless Franco-Americans who've shared their stories over the years. In fact, I want to dedicate this talk to 2 of them, Rita Cote and her husband, Ronald, whom we lost to COVID-19 in late 2020. Their presence within the community is deeply missed. As was said, this presentation is based on the book, The Franco-Americans of Lewiston-Auburn, which I co-authored with James Mayall, so I have to acknowledge James. The images that I'm going to use throughout this presentation in PowerPoint are images from the Franco-American collection at USM, University of Southern Maine's Lewiston-Auburn College. And I want to thank them for permission to use these images. First, I'd like to define Franco-American, and I will put up my PowerPoint as well. I'll share my screen. And there. Okay. I'd like to define the term Franco-American, which does not correspond to the definition one finds in the dictionary. Whoops. Play from start. Okay. Rather, it refers to a group of people who most often define themselves as French or Français, but whom scholars refer to as Franco-Americans because they have a very specific history. They are a unique group whose roots lie both across the Atlantic and in France, across the Atlantic in France, but also to the north. They're people descended from the French who settled in the colonies of Acadia and New France. It is true, like many other immigrant groups to the United States, their origins are in Europe, but their histories were also shaped by centuries in North America, in what is now Canada and parts of the United States. The scholar Susan Pinnett has often pointed out the Franco-Americans' ancestors did not come through Ellis Island. Those ancestors include the Acadians displaced by the British between 1755 and 1763, and if not deported, displaced farther into the hinterland of Acadia, including into the St. John Valley in Maine. They also include the French speakers in Quebec who came to be dominated by English speakers when Great Britain acquired French colonies in North America through the 1763 Treaty of Paris. Shifts in territorial possession created a border space that remained fluid well after the United States achieved independence. And this is a map, it's in French because it was the best one I could find. The gray area that you see in the map is the disputed territory between Canada and the United States. The green line on the map is the actual border. So you can see that there was quite a lot of territory that was in dispute until this treaty in 1842. And even then, the US-Canadian border remained relatively permeable until the 20th century. You could go across with a driver's license. You didn't need a passport. The Franco-Americans are thus a transnational ethnic group, people of a borderland, much like the borderland that Gloria Anzaldúa and scholars after her have identified in the region between the southwestern United States and Mexico. Okay. The French speakers who came to the cities of Lewiston and Auburn are in many ways emblematic of the almost 1 million French-speaking immigrants who left Canada for the United States in the period between roughly 1840 and 1930. But in many ways, they are unique, as they have been able to maintain their cultural heritage over 4 or 5 generations. They therefore defy the paradigm of immigration first posited by Robert Clark and later developed by Milton Gordon in 1964, in which an ethnic group has assimilated into mainstream society within 3 generations. This makes the Franco-Americans of Northern New England different from the Franco-Americans of Southern New England. Historian Leslie Choquette has considered this 3-generational model as quite applicable to the Franco-American community of Worcester, Massachusetts. And indeed, that was my husband's family's experience. My focus today is less on theories of assimilation, but rather on cultural persistence. Today, I'll present the foundational period that established the groundwork for the retention of culture in Lewiston and Auburn. Then I'll discuss briefly pressures on Franco-Americans to assimilate and their efforts to resist those pressures. And finally, I'll suggest that what we can learn from Franco-Americans and their experience in the Twin Cities. Like many other industrial cities in New England, Lewiston became a mill town powered by the river that separates it from its neighbor on the other bank, Auburn. The earliest documented Franco-Americans began arriving in 1860, although there is some evidence of some Quebecois migrants working in the Twin Cities even earlier. French-Canadian farmers often took on seasonal labor, such as in lumber camps, construction sites, or in industry. This pattern of geographic mobility, in fact, marks them as a transnational group well before the 20th century. In Lewiston, they worked in the booming textile mills, Les Moulins, while they also provided the labor force for Auburn's shoe industry in what they called Les Shoe Shop. While by the 1890s, Franco-Americans had truly settled in the Twin Cities, their proximity to Quebec and Acadia, that is the maritime provinces in northern Maine by this point, allowed them to return home for visits and special occasions, to maintain contact with their places of origin, and to remain transnational. As in many New England towns, French-Canadian immigrants in Lewiston first settled in a part of town called Petit Canada, or Little Canada, a part of town near the Grand Trunk Railroad, where many had first arrived. And this is a photo from a few years back. This building has become a restaurant and is presently not being used because of the pandemic. The French speakers in Lewiston soon spilled over across the South Bridge on the river to the neighborhood of New Auburn, which is another prominent Franco-American neighborhood. Descriptions of Lewiston's Little Canada vary, but it's clear that conditions in the district were insalubrious, with overcrowded housing and a city dump nearby where children actually played. An interviewee from the Franco-American collection, Céleste Lavigne, described her three-story apartment block in the 1890s. The first floor was commercial space. Each of 4 families had 2 rooms on the second floor with extra sleeping space on the third floor, so you slept where you could. There were no stoves and no heat. Some people actually lived partially underground in basements. On the other hand, a newspaper account in an English-speaking newspaper describes narrow, sunny streets, music and song coming from porches or windows, and French spoken everywhere. So it's a very different description than Celeste's. The Franco-Americans first worshipped at a Roman Catholic church founded by the Irish, but established their own church in 1870 in a former Protestant church, and thereby founding their own French parish. And this is an image of Lincoln Street in Lewiston. If you look in the background, that is the Bates Mill. The first church was on Lincoln Street. However, with the help of a diocesan priest from Saint Hyacinthe, Quebec, Saint Hyacinthe, Father Pierre Eve, they built St. Peter's Church, consecrated in 1873. And this is the original St. Peter's Church in Lewiston. There followed parish schools, and this is St. Peter's Church as it's being constructed much later in the 20th century. So they tore down the old church, used the basement for quite a number of years, and then reconstructed what is now the Basilica of St. Peter's and Paul. It's one of the defining landmarks in the city of Lewiston, and is lit up at night on the skyline. This is the first school in Little Canada on Lincoln Street, and it was first taught by 2 lay people who taught the children of Little Canada. But then Father Eve called for an order from his hometown, Saint Hyacinthe, Quebec, to come to Lewiston. They were the Sisters of Charity, also known as the Grey Nuns. And they were not a teaching order. They primarily ministered to children, the sick, and the poor, and the elderly. And when I say children, they were mostly orphan children, but they agreed to come on Eve's invitation. The Franco-Americans also established mutual aid societies, social societies like the Jacques Cartier Institute, or the St. Jean-Baptiste, or the St. John Baptist Society. They established their own newspaper. It was called Le Messager. And this is from around the early 1900s, 1910. The staff of the Messager with their offices on Lincoln Street. There's actually quite a famous person in the upper right of this image. Her name is Camille Lassard-Bissonnette, and she was a Franco-American woman author who wrote a really famous novel called Canuck. This is the Dominican block. The Dominican fathers came to Lewiston-Auburn in the 1880s and replaced Father Ave. And the block itself consisted of commercial space on the first floor. It's in the heart of Little Canada. And you can see some of the three-deckers that are in the background. It's a 5-story building. It had space for classrooms and on the upper floors, and also a hall where mass could be said and where performances could be given. Okay. And this is one of the earliest enterprises in Lewiston. It's the Marcotte Furniture Store today, and you can see that in the upper right-hand corner. But this particular image from about 1900 shows it as a general goods store. And people would get off of the railroad, find an apartment, often with the help of people from the Marcotte store, and then they'd go back to the store to furnish that apartment. And so this was one of the very first successful enterprises. Another successful enterprise was the DuPont Bakery in Auburn, Maine. So there were lots of Franco-American entrepreneurs who catered to basic needs of their community: food, furniture, and another industry that was really important given how high mortality rates were at that time was the mortuary industry. There are also people that, Franco-Americans that, created businesses in the construction industry and so on. Okay. And then there is the hospital. The Franco-American, and this too was established by the Grey Nuns, the Sisters of Charity, in 1888, 10 years after they arrived in the cities. The Franco-Americans in the Twin Cities, in fact, created a French-speaking city within the Anglophone Yankee city around them. The founding of St. Mary's Hospital illustrates the doubling of Yankee and French institutions. Mill work was dangerous. The crowded conditions in Little Canada led to the spread of disease, and the Grey Nuns, the Sisters of Charity of St. Hyacinth, who had been invited to come teach, recognized the crying need for a hospital. Since none existed at the time in the Twin Cities, they were able to purchase a farm, the Golder Farm, on what was then the outskirts of Lewiston, and establish the first Catholic hospital in the state. The majority of local doctors, however, were Yankee and Protestant and refused to practice in what they called the Sisters' Hospital. They instead created the Central Maine General Hospital with a generous subsidy from the state, in fact. The French hospital was staffed by local doctors like Dr. Louis Martel, who, like other professionals from Quebec, had settled in Lewiston-Auburn. And there were also doctors from Quebec who visited on a rotating basis. Eventually, however, Yankee doctors visited their own patients at St. Mary's, for the sisters accepted patients regardless of creed, and they discovered a first-rate facility and eventually began to practice at the French hospital, as it was called thereafter. By the turn of the century, the Franco-American community had developed its own identity. It held on to cherished customs like the holiday traditions of Christmas, New Year's, Easter, the feast of Saint John the Baptist, Saint Jean-Baptiste, and continued with other kinds of traditions from Canada, house parties featuring music and dance, and foods like tourtière, pea soup, sugar pie, and tir à neige, or snow taffy. And the woman I mentioned in the beginning once treated one of my students to a session of making snow taffy. So the Franco community had established not only the institutions previously mentioned, but an enormous number of social and fraternal organizations for religious purposes, cultural activities, and sports. This is an image of Jean-Baptiste Couture, who was one of the first editors of the French newspaper, Le Messager. But here he's in a play in the leading role. The play is Fra Diavolo. And he was a leader in a lot of cultural associations associated with music and the theater. So he too is another important leader. Between the 1890s and 1930, the Franco-American community increased in size and visibility. And here's another image, and this is for sports. The first racketing clubs, the first snowshoe clubs, were established in the early 20th century in Lewiston-Auburn. This is an ice palace on what was then the Lewiston City Park, and then some snowshoers who are having a lot of fun, probably been up all night partying, although the man on the left is the first police commissioner who was of French-Canadian descent. So there was a continued influx of immigrants from Canada and northern Maine. By 1910, the Francos were the majority population in Lewiston, and although their population in Auburn never surpassed 50%, their numbers continued to increase. The density of the Franco-American population in the Twin Cities is no doubt an important factor in their cultural persistence that is not likely to be replicated. Well, it was certainly possible to move about one's day entirely in French in the Twin Cities for well over a century. This did not mean that French Canadians and Franco-Americans in turn did not participate in the broader society. Dr. Louis Martel, and this is a bust created by Robert Wiseman, his protege, after his death. He died young, apparently infected by from a surgery that he had performed around 1897. He himself Martel had become naturalized and enjoined his compatriots to do the same, as did the local paper, Le Messager. Here's a translation by my co-author of a quote from the paper from March 1881, so quite early. "We will never be French-speaking Anglos. You must stop thinking of us as if we are only passing through. We are starting to want to become American citizens, as is our right." And this is a banner from one of the societies in town. And it says at the top, religion and nationality. And then it says loyal, but French Canadian. And it is typical of the kind of hybrid identity that Franco-Americans possessed, and before that, French Canadians in the Twin Cities. Martel himself served as an alderman from Little Canada, as an alderman, and also in the state legislature. Community leaders realized that in order to resist the assimilation into the Anglo or Yankee vision of society, they needed political clout. The very first Franco alderman was from Little Canada, Leon Lefebvre, and was elected in 1880. It was not until 1921 that Dr. Robert Wiseman, he who created the bust, Martel's protege, was elected the first Franco-American mayor of Lewiston. You'll note that the name Wiseman is not especially French. In fact, he was born in Stanfield, now Princeville, Quebec, in 1871 to Scots and Irish parents, and moved to Lewiston as an infant, where he was quickly orphaned. He grew up largely in the French-speaking community and married a Franco-American, Rose Cyr. And at his election, he gave his speeches, for example, in both English and French, and his name may have helped him secure election among Anglos. But in any case, at his election, the Messager, the newspaper's headline read, "It's a Canadian victory. C'est une victoire canadienne." From 1932 to 1970, each of 20 mayors in Lewiston was Franco. Despite their political dominance, the drive to assimilate was strong. I don't have time to treat the topic in depth, but will instead point to several important forces. The rise of the Ku Klux Klan in Maine in the 1920s revealed the depth of anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic sentiment in the state, and the discrimination Franco-Americans faced here. The platform of the Republican Party was to defend public schools in the hope that parish schools, which offered bilingual education, could eventually be eliminated. In 1919, the Maine state legislature passed a law prohibiting French in the public schools, a law that remained on the books until the late 1960s. There was also a law passed in 1891 that voters needed to pass an English literacy test, which is why the schools it was important that the parish schools were bilingual. Education in the many parochial schools was no doubt a key factor in cultural persistence. There was also the opportunity to attend preparatory schools in French Canada, which were less costly than private schools in the United States. Armand Dufresne Jr., an Auburn native who rose to become the first Franco-American Chief Justice of the Maine Supreme Judicial Court, is one example of someone who attended a school in Quebec on a scholarship from the Union Saint Jean-Baptiste, the St. Jean-Baptiste Society, before he went to law school in Boston. Not all Franco-Americans were able to overcome the push to assimilate. Some, ashamed of their working class origins and a kind of spoken French that was denigrated as inferior to so-called Parisian French, stopped them from claiming their heritage and from being anything but American. One of our interviewees, who had married and changed her name from Bouchard to Thompson, remarked that she was treated very differently with an Anglo name than when she had been a Bouchard. The psychic damage done from assimilation is neatly summed up by poet Alfred Poulin, a native of Lisbon Falls, a town that borders Lewiston, and he grew up in the 1950s. So most French Canadian came of age in the 1950s. And I quote, "Most French Canadian Americans, or Franco-Canadian Canucks of my generation," and that's what we were and we're not, "neither French nor Canadian nor genuinely American, we spent the better part of our adolescence and early childhood working feverishly hard at negating and trying to erase all traces of our Quebecois heritage. First the accent, then the language, then the faith, the customs, the manners, anything that could be scraped, shaved, or singed off," unquote. In the period after the Second World War, the rise of television, the civil rights movement, church reform, that is the Second Vatican Council from 1962 to 65 in the Roman Catholic Church, and industrial and economic decline all impacted Lewiston and Auburn's Franco-Americans. And speaking of hybrid identities and a push to assimilate, this is a photo of Sylvia and Jose Roy at WCOU Studios, which was also started by the Couture family, the man that was in the costume earlier. So radio was really important, but notice that they are wearing cowboy outfits in country and Western style. There was another important country and Western singer who actually went on to national fame. Her name was Betty Cody, but originally Rita Cote. She was not, she was born in Quebec and lived in Lewiston. And at the end of her career, or sometime in the middle, she went back to singing in French rather than doing her country and Western songs. In the latter half of the 20th century, other Franco-Americans clearly became acculturated to American society, but had not necessarily assimilated, and Betty would be one of them. Some were able to negotiate a hybrid identity that was both Franco and American, in military service, for example, where the language of home was a useful tool in Europe or Vietnam. Yet the integral connection between language and culture had been loosened and in some cases severed. As parish schools became less affordable after Vatican II and gradually closed, mostly in the early 2000s. Still, in the later decades of the 20th century, American society at large had gained a new appreciation for ethnic and racial diversity, bilingualism, and multiculturalism. The past 50 years have seen a resurgence in Franco-American pride, a reinvention of community identity, and a cultural renaissance. I'll mention briefly some highlights. The Franco-American Heritage Center was founded by teachers Joanne Lapointe and Louise Forg in 1972. They are the two women at the right in this photo. And its materials, in fact, form the basis of the Franco-American collection at University of Southern Maine, Lewiston-Auburn College, a lot of them in my slide presentation, in fact. The Franco-American collection continues to program on Franco-Americans to this day. These days it's on Zoom, as we are now. Franco-American festivals debuted in 1976 in the Twin Cities and continued for many years. I think the most notable was called the Festival of Joy, the Festival de Joie. What is now the Gendron Franco Center for Heritage and the Performing Arts was founded in 2000. It is housed in the former St. Mary's Church, and it is a performing arts center, but it also features things like La Rencontre, which was a meeting. It's called The Meeting, but it's a luncheon once a month, and there people would speak French and socialize. And you'll notice the young woman who's serving is in fact one of the more recent immigrants from a French-speaking country. So the Rencontre was open to all, not just Franco-Americans, but other French speakers of all kinds. And so there's been a large influx of refugees and asylum seekers from Somalia first, and they in fact often did some programming at the center. And now there has been a more recent influx that come from Rwanda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Djibouti, to name just a few. And what had become a highly private language, French, spoken within families, has once again become a language useful in public spaces in Lewiston-Auburn. Some Franco-Americans are reacquiring a language they lost in early childhood, while other generations are learning French for the first time. Efforts to reestablish bilingual education in Lewiston will have to wait until the pandemic has run its course, unfortunately. A lot has been delayed because of our current circumstances. But in conclusion, the Franco-American community has had to reimagine what it means to be Franco-American over the course of the decades. And they also have to reimagine what it means to be an immigrant in a much larger context. However, the early foundations laid in the 19th century, the density of Franco-Americans and their descendants in this region, and it's estimated that Lewiston has about 60% of its population is descended from Franco-Americans and 30% in Auburn. And then the transnational nature of the community as well has allowed it to persist. And I'm going to end with a slide, which is includes some students and people from the Franco Center and other local groups. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor DeFosse, for that fantastic presentation. And I hope that we will be able to have a lively discussion based on that. So for those of you who have a question, as I mentioned, there are two ways to do that. You can either ask a question via the Q&A box, or you can raise your hand and I will promote you to panelist so that you can be on video and audio. So go ahead and do that if you guys have any questions, and I will call on you. Okay, looks like we have someone with their hand raised, Lauren. So I'm going to.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Hi. I was wondering if you, Mary, had any background knowledge about the connection to Franco-Americans in Biddeford, and how, if they're at all related to the people that landed in Lewiston.
Yeah, I don't have, precise parts of Canada from which they came. I know that Lewiston's population came from the Beauce, but certainly there was interaction between the communities. Biddeford also had a high population of Franco-Americans, and again, some of the same conditions prevailed there. What might have been somewhat different is that Lewiston is really unique in that St. Peter and Paul Parish was given in perpetuity to the Dominican order by Bishop James Augustine Healy in the 1880s when Father Eve left. And so therefore, Lewiston evolved somewhat differently because it was independent of the Irish hierarchy in the Catholic Church. So that's one distinctive thing about Lewiston and Auburn. Auburn obviously had diocesan parishes, but I don't know for sure if this, the people from Biddeford came from the same parts of Canada. I would imagine that there was a lot of movement between the cities. I do know, for example, that some of the earliest immigrants were first in Biddeford. This notion of migration and moving and mobility. So the first family that is documented in Lewiston is called the Kerrigan family, or the Kerrigan family. And a person named Joseph LeBlanc, who established an early business, the Lewiston Bleachery, or steam and dye house. It was like a laundry. He lived in Biddeford before he lived in Lewiston, but he had lived in other places in the United States too. So there's a lot of mobility between these Franco-American centers, especially in the early days of immigration. I hope that helps.
Yeah, well, that's a good point, because you sort of think of went from Canada and then they landed and that's it. Well, maybe they went from Canada to Biddeford back and then into Lewiston, Auburn region later. So I hadn't actually really thought about that.
That's quite possible. And they could have gone back to Canada in between. That was really typical. A third of those people that came eventually went back to Canada. They stayed only as migrants and, did what they needed to do, raise enough cash to go back to the farm or wherever they went. Some of them went west, depending. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, we have a couple hands raised and then a lot of questions in the Q&A box. So we're not going to be able to get through to them, but there are some interesting questions. So Vivian Bullock asks, Woonsocket, Rhode Island was heavily settled by French Canadians during the 19th century. who came to work in the city's many mills. Do you know if Lewiston had any knowledge or interaction with the French in Woonsocket? And I'm going to kind of expand on that and ask, what were the kind of connections between all these historic French-American cities, mostly in New England, I assume, but potentially other parts of the Northeast as well?
Sure. The newspaper that I mentioned, the Messager, was widely diffused throughout New England. So it would carry, important news from Quebec or from, New England to all of these Franco-American strongholds. In terms of Woonsocket, I think Woonsocket is more like Lewiston than Worcester in some sense, because the density of the population there was quite high. I can remember people in Woonsocket speaking French in the 70s in the street. So that was quite late for Southern New England. So I'd say that Woonsocket's something of an anomaly. And of course, Woonsocket has its own heritage center, right? It's a museum,
Yep.
a wonderful museum. Yeah. But so these communities were interconnected. People did travel from one community to another, particularly early on. But I think there was always interaction. And again, they kept up with the news from other parts of New England. Yeah.
Right, thank you. All right, I'm going to alternate between the people raising their hands and the ones asking the Q&A. So we're going to promote Lucy Desjardins to a panelist. So Lucy, if you could just activate your camera and your microphone. Thank you.
Hi, I grew up in Lewiston. I was born in the mid 40s. I left left Maine in the late 60s, and I'm now back to Maine, living in Wells. I recently completed my genealogy, and all of my ancestors are French Canadian, and came from Canada. And that's one way to resist assimilation, by the way. You just marry your own kind. But I'd like to say, although some of my grandparents and great-grandparents came from the Beauce area, 3 of my greats moved from Kamouraska to Lewiston-Auburn with their parents and siblings in the 1870s. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of Desjardins in Kamouraska.
That's welcome back to Maine.
Well, thank you. And
yes.
also the Biddeford thing, one of my great grandmothers I know very little about, she grew up in a small island called Île aux Canots, which is off of Île aux Grues in the St. Lawrence. And somehow she left that beautiful little place and ended up in Lewiston. And I don't know how. I can't find any trace of how she did it. But I did find that one of her aunts was in Biddeford.
Yeah, and the other Biddeford connection is when there was a shoe strike in Lewiston in 1937. And when the workers went on strike, they were often not able to find jobs after the strike because it was broken by authorities and the mill owners. It was a shoe strike. So they, some of them found work in Biddeford. So there are connections, and there are, people were able to move around, and, people from the local area have relatives in Connecticut. It's not, again, this is a very mobile group of people.
Yeah. Thank
you, Lucy. All right, we're going to go back to the Q&A chat, and I apologize, we're getting a lot of questions, so we're not going to be able to get to them all. Kathleen Stein-Smith asked, what are your thoughts on the future of the French language and Francophone culture in Maine and the United States? Maybe you can start with the main part. Are you optimistic about, the preservation and really promotion of French in Maine and Lewiston?
Yeah, wow. I'd like to be optimistic. I hope that French continues to be spoken. I think there's a lot of interest today because it's such a useful language given our new populations. And they actually, I attended an event about 2 years ago at the Franco Center, the Gender and Franco Center, where there were both Franco-Americans and New Mainers from Africa who talked about why French was important to them. And what they said was just lovely. A lot of them talked about poetry and music. And I think if that kind of spirit continues, we'll be able to get support for things like bilingual education, which I would like to see in Lewiston. It's pretty hard to know right now what the state of French is. So I guess I would say I am not a Pollyanna. I am cautiously optimistic that I think that French will continue to be used in Lewiston, but to the extent that it is now, there have been different movements, right? So in the 1980s, people just were talking about French dying out, and my students were able to find all kinds of native speakers with which to speak, and that's how we ended up doing oral histories, because they were out there. I think that we've tried to bury French too often, and that it may come back. I do think it's the fastest growing language in the world because of Francophone Africa, and it's an important language internationally in many ways, and also Canada is our largest trading partner still. So those are all reasons, especially in Maine, to continue with French, but certainly elsewhere in the United States. And, I'm obviously a proponent, just as a professor of French and Francophone studies.
Absolutely. I think we really should push that point about French being the fastest growing language in the world, because I've heard people say to me, oh, French is a dying language, and it's literally the exact opposite. So it's, I think we really got to keep pushing that. All right, so I'm going to promote Ron to panelists. He has a question. He just rose his hand. Okay, maybe that's not coming through, so we're gonna try Susan. All right, Susan, you can put on your camera and your microphone.
What I would like to know, people will often say to me, well, Suzanne, you don't speak Parisian French. I used to take that as a slap in the face, but my response anymore is, no, I didn't grow up in Paris, but I don't speak London English either. That's kind of a put down, but I'm tired of being told that I don't speak a proper French. And I love speaking with the people from the Congo, because they've learned French in school and they speak a beautiful French. And I love their little ethnic newspaper that comes out once a month here in Maine, and you should look it up because there's several columns written in French.
Yes, that's Jambo Africa, I believe, is the title of the newspaper. And I would agree with you that it's just a question of getting used to an accent, and I'm not sure that Parisian French exists. I mean, there are a lot of people in Paris, and I think it's a reference that was used in North America to denigrate a different kind of French. But in fact, Lewiston's hockey team went over to, this was in the 50s, from the Bates Mill, there was a hockey team. And the reporter said, boy, they sound like our grandfathers from Normandy. So it's interesting that things come around. I don't think, and I just want to point out, Fabrice Jomont has said that Maine needs a bilingual revolution, and I would agree. But thank you for your comment. I'm sure the local French, it took me a while to get used to it, but it takes me a while to understand Scots people too, or Irish people. So,
But I've been to Paris, and everybody laughed when I mentioned that comment, that you don't speak Parisian French.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you. Right, we have a question from François Modave in French. Pourquoi est-ce que les immigrants ont émigré à Lewiston plutôt qu'une autre partie des États-Unis? And I guess I guess why was it, was it just the proximity to Canada? And if it was so close to Canada, what was the point of moving in the first place? And then I guess to add on to that, why did the immigration stop? Mm-hmm. Or at least in large numbers?
Yeah, it slowed down. They didn't come to Lewiston first. They often went south. They went where the railroad took them. So the railroads were established in southern New England before they were in northern New England. In fact, people were migrating in the late 1830s to places like I'm going to Massachusetts, to I think it's Southbridge, right? And that's even before the railroads. So they didn't come first to Maine because it was close. They came because of the railroad. There were migrant laborers in Maine because it was close. They come down the Canada Road from Jackman down to the coast. And they often ended up in places like Waterville or Skowhegan because it was on the road. But they didn't stay in Canada because there wasn't enough work. The mill cities in New England were booming, and there was less, that the transfer to industry in Canada was slower. So that's why they came. But they did go to other places in the United States. Camille Sarr, who was the author I mentioned, the author of Canuck, she she lived in Lewiston. She worked for the newspaper. She wrote for the newspaper, went back to Canada. She was in fact a suffragette. Then she traveled to the Midwest of the United States and worked for the railroads. And then she went to California. So again, Franco-Americans were very mobile as a population. So, I think the ones that did come to Lewiston in the long run came because they had family here. They would come down, because they came from the same parish as somebody else who had come, or they had, aunts and uncles, brothers, cousins, and that was why they showed up here.
Thank you. All right, Christopher has raised his hand, so we're going to promote him to panelist.
Much is often spoken of the difficulties that Franco-Americans experienced in Maine, but I would like to know if there's any information, any statistics on the success rate of the last two generations of Franco-Americans in Maine.
There actually was a report about Franco-Americans in Maine done in, I want to say 2015, but I'm not 100% sure, by the state government. And it did not emphasize success. I think we recently did an exhibit at the Franco-American collection at Lewiston-Auburn College that focused on entrepreneurs, and those are success stories. Those are people that did well and gained social mobility. But what the study found about Franco-Americans in Maine is that they tend to lag behind in education, especially higher education, and that it still is difficult for Franco-Americans to be socially successful, is what was found. I did not do that study. It was done by a commission of the state government, but my co-author worked on that. So I'm not sure, I don't think we've had enough study of success. we've tend to focus on people that have not succeeded. And again, that was why we did that, the exhibit on entrepreneurship, which has yet to open because of COVID.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do any of the attendees have questions?
Say yes, I do.
Yes, I
Ron
do.
Haroon.
Ron Heroux.
Yep, Ron.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We here in Rhode Island have both what I would call a Richelieu Club and Alliance Française. Does that exist in Maine? And I noticed that Alliance Française seems to be more active, younger people, and the Richelieu Club in Rhode Island is called Aram Patsye now. Seems to be older people. Anything going on in Maine like that?
Yeah, there has been an Alliance Française established in Portland, and it's doing wonderful programming, especially in this month of Francophonie. Unfortunately, some of the other clubs are no longer in existence. One of the important ones was, it was called since the 30s La Survivance, but it was really a social club in the end, and that is defunct. And then there was the Association Canado-American, the ACA, and that is no longer, as far as I know, it doesn't exist, but it's no longer in Lewiston. It's been gone for maybe 10 years. Yeah, so these are, the good news is that we do have the Alliance Française and that it's quite active. My
only concern is trying to get l'Alliance to recognize that there is more French than just France, that there's a lot of French in North America, including yes. Louisiana. And I mean, I know we're all really, our ancestors are all from France, but I want to make sure they get presentations on what's going on in North America, Quebec, and New England.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think you're right on target with that. Actually, the most densely populated part of the country in terms of French speakers is still New England, even though Louisiana has a very vibrant French-speaking community. So that always surprises me, but it is true.
Yep. All right, so we actually have the embassy's education attaché who's with us, and he has raised his hand. So I'm going to promote Fabrice Chaumont to a panelist.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fabrice.
A wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
I had a question regarding Louisiana and Code of Field. Mm-hmm. Obviously, I wonder if there's been any attempt at creating Code of Field in the past, and can it be done? Is this something that could be done in the future?
In Maine.
In Maine, yeah.
Yeah. I think we're going to have to start locally. I think that there is great interest, and I think I'm lucky to be living in a community where French is still alive and well and up and coming in some very real ways. It's impossible to try to burden the local school department at the present moment. You know, they're just, let alone, I mean, as a teacher myself, I'm finding myself, you know, living day to day. I think we'll have to wait till the vaccines are out there. But it's a project, perhaps not Code of Field, but local towns and cities maybe establishing bilingual programs.
Code of Field was also a legislative effort.
Yes.
So it's really backed up by law and
yes.
Obviously funding that came with it. And I wonder if this is something with the current, I know the Speaker of the House has now claimed his French heritage. Yes. I wonder if there could be a move towards that.
It's a possibility. I mean, I know of people who have pressured the state government to move in this direction. I have not seen, I think it's important, for example, to keep French program in the state universities. And at one point, that was not happening. They were eliminating humanities programs, and languages were targets of those. So we're lucky that some of those language programs have been reinstated, for example, at the University of Southern Maine. But you know, I think that's where I think we're behind a place like Louisiana. You know, well, I don't think that it will happen at the state level personally, but that's my opinion. Doesn't mean we can't try, but.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Noah, for organizing this.
Thank you, Fabrice. Yeah, and actually the consul is going to be speaking to Ryan Infecto later this month. So, we'll see if anything can happen, and I'll send you an email, Fabrice, so we can strategize on that meeting. Hopefully something good can come out of that.
My local senator, his name has been anglicized, but he is of French descent, and can speak French well. And he, you know, he's a mover and shaker in his party. So, yeah.
All right, so we've gone just a little over 3. So out of respect for everyone's time, I think we're going to end the meeting. But it has been recorded. So if you have signed up, I will send out an email with the recording. And if you have any extra questions that you want to be answered, and if Professor DeFosse is okay with that, you can send me an email, and then I will forward them to Professor DeFosse. My email is in the email that you got when you signed up. It's noah.ouellette@diplomacy.gouv.fr. So please feel send me those questions, and then I will also send out the recording. So thank you so much for that presentation, Professor. And we encourage you all to check out our other 4 webinars, which will be coming later this month. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.